If you've never outlined a book, or you've written a book that has derailed, writing an outline might be the perfect solution to map out your book's direction and get your story back on track. Hello, writers in training, and welcome to my 8th and last episode of my series, How to Write a Fiction Book. I'm Shannon, writing under the pen name SD Houston. Today, we're going to take a look at my outlining process. For those pantsers out there, alternatives don't exist. And this is usually where the line in the sand is drawn. With that said, we're about to get heavy into details, so let's dive into the world of outlining. There are so many outlining methods available for writers, so this episode is going to show you just one way to approach how to outline your story idea. Using this method, it took me roughly 2 to 3 weeks to complete my outline for my debut novel, and at the start of NaNoWriMo in November of 2020, I began writing my story. 19 days later, I was done with my first draft with a total word count of 60,978 words. For those of you who know a little bit about different outlining methods, then you'll recognize my hodgepodge, which was influenced by the snowflake method, the 3-act structure, the Save the Cat outline created by Blake Snyder, and K.M. Weiland's Guide to Outlining Novels from her book Creating Character Arcs. And the majority of my outlining actually comes from Weiland's book. She writes the character arc as intrinsic to the plot points, which I think is important as it means the protagonist will often drive the story and not have the plot happen to him or her. The protagonist starts the story with an emotional wound and a lie that she or he believes to be the truth. For myself, I feel this is the most useful way to create the outline for your story since I appreciate emotionally wounded characters. However, while I try to integrate the character arc with each plot point, the depth of Weiland's method is not prescriptive. And I don't meet every rule from her book. It's just one way of approaching the development of my novel. So I also urge you to use what works for your specific story. I won't be sharing a How I Did It section in today's episode, as I don't want to give away my novel's entire plot. But like the other steps in my series, I did follow a specific structure to complete my outline, but allowed myself room to change if the story called for it. However, I will sprinkle in some examples from the movie Thor, and many of these points actually come directly from K.M. Weiland's book and a website article she wrote, which I will link below. So note, spoilers ahead for the movie Thor. I do my outlines in 2 parts with 2 separate Word documents because I like to start broad and then narrow down my ideas. It may help to download the pit stop associated with this episode and follow along. Note that my outlining process involves my character having both an emotional wound with a lie that he or she believes to be truth and a positive character arc. So this method of outlining will reflect that. In our example, Thor starts the movie with a lie that might makes right, and he believes that he will grow up to be king regardless of his personal merits. Part 1, the outline. Part 1 has 5 steps. Step 1, write a 1-sentence synopsis of your novel and 3 obstacles that will challenge your protagonist, your main character. If you have followed along so far in this series, then you should have your 1-line synopsis and 3 obstacles. However, if this is the first video you are watching, then I suggest reviewing episode 6 of the series if you're not sure how to write the 1-sentence synopsis or 3 obstacles. Here is a funny example of the 1-sentence synopsis for Thor, which I found online. Adopted kid's older brother won't let him hold the hammer. I still think this is funny, but we can get more serious. So here is an example for Thor. While his brother plots mischief at home, a powerful god is stripped of his powers for inciting war and sent away to face his greatest threat. The 3 obstacles from Thor. 1. After disobeying his father and attacking the frost giants, Thor is stripped of his power and banished to Earth. 2. After confidently battling his way through S.H.I.E.L.D.'s hastily erected compound, Thor is stunned to realize he cannot lift his hammer. 3. Loki sends the golem to kill Thor and lays waste to Earth. Step 2. Setup. Write 1 sentence to give the backdrop and story setup. This is the exposition, the status quo at the start of the story. Example setup from Thor. Thor prepares to ascend to the throne of Asgard, a peaceful and prosperous planet, which enables his prideful misconceptions. Step 3. Hook. This is the beginning of your story, an enticing hook found in the first line or opening scene, which is often found in the first chapter at about the 1% mark. But there are many schools of thought on this. Ideally, your hook should fit into your narrative organically, so give yourself room to work with. Anywhere in your first scene works well, though the earlier you can comfortably include it, the better. The hook should introduce your protagonist. If your protagonist has an emotional wound, as discussed in episode 5 of this series, then this is the point in this story that your protagonist believes his or her lie that has so far proven necessary or functional in the existing normal world. Write this as one sentence. Example hook from Thor. Thor's lie is practically handed to him by his father, who tells him straight out he was born to be king. Step 4, inciting incident. This is the call to adventure when the protagonist first encounters the main conflict. This is also when there's a hint that the lie will no longer serve the protagonist as effectively as it has in the past. Example exciting incident from Thor. During the ceremony naming Thor heir to Asgard's throne, frost giants invade the palace and nearly steal back their powerful casket. Step 5, conclusion. It's hard to create a map for your story if you don't know where you're going to end up. This is where your protagonist either enters a new normal world or returns to the original normal world. If your protagonist had an emotional wound, he or she can now live as a truth-empowered individual, no longer held back by his or her lie from the beginning of the novel. So how will your story resolve? Write a one-sentence conclusion to your story. Example conclusion from Thor. Thor apologizes to his father and gets the gatekeeper Heimdall to tell him about what's happened to Jane back on Earth. That's the end of part 1. At this point, I usually stew a bit before hopping into part 2. I allow these big ideas to percolate in my mind, and I imagine what could happen between each of these big ideas, and how my main character could react, and whether or not she could grow as a character as a result of these ideas. Usually, I will begin to envision scenes, and if they excite me, I type them up in a few sentences, sometimes including the dialogue, as this is often what I see in my mind. I keep a running document of scene ideas during my outlining process. Eventually, I end up using most of them, while some become irrelevant or happen off the page. So when you're ready, let's move into part 2. Part 2, the extended outline. For this part, I open a brand new Word document, and this is where the outline becomes a bit fuller. I separate everything by 3 acts. For each of these sections, I will usually write anywhere from 2 to 5 sentences. Act 1. Act 1 introduces your protagonist and the everyday environment. It includes your hook, your setup, your inciting incident, and your first obstacle, which we will now call your first plot point. And you can think of Act 1 as making up approximately 15 to 25% of your total book length. To start, bring in your one sentence from your hook, your setup, your inciting incident, and your first plot point, that first obstacle. Now fill these out to a full paragraph or at least 2 sentences. Expand on your ideas. We are going to define and add a little more to your first plot point. Note, it's okay if your obstacles change when defining the plot points. Your first plot point is a major event that kicks off the story, and will come at about the 20 to 25% mark of your book. This is where the protagonist is faced with a consequential choice, a key turning point that your protagonist must overcome. Example first plot point from Thor. After disobeying his father and attacking the frost giants, Thor is stripped of his power and banished to Earth, where he smashes into the van of astrophysicist Jane Foster, who is investigating the wormholes caused by the Bifrost. Thor is tossed out of the normal world of the first act. He enters the adventure world of the second act. He encounters the main conflict, how to get back home, and meets the last of the important characters, Jane, Eric, and Darcy. If your protagonist has an emotional wound, this is where the old ways of the lie-ridden first act show themselves ineffective in the face of the main conflict's new stakes. You want to think about how to introduce and reinforce the character's lie and indicate the character's potential to overcome the lie. A small scene that indicates Thor's potential to change is when he throws his cup onto the ground in the diner, smashing it, and then he asks for another. He believes he's mighty and others should fulfill his wishes. When Jane points out his inappropriate actions, he agrees to act more appropriately. In Act 1, although the protagonist does not yet recognize the inefficacy of the lie, he will still pass through a door of no return, in which he is forced to leave the normal world of the first act and enter the adventure world of the main conflict in Act 2. Act 2. Act 2 showcases your protagonist's journey toward achieving the story goal, opposing the antagonist, and developing as a character. Act 2 can make up anywhere from 50 to 70% of your total book. And it starts with your protagonist in her new world as she reacts to the events of the first plot point. She may also see the rules of the lie she believed no longer apply. In this act, you will bring in your other 2 obstacles from part 1, which will become your midpoint and your third plot point. We will also add 2 pinch points. You'll want to flesh all of this out with at least 2 to 5 sentences. Let's look at these in order. First, pinch point. Pinch points are nothing more or less than a reminder of the antagonistic force's power to stymie the protagonist's goal. The first pinch point provides new information to the plot that begins setting up the major events in the midpoint. And it needs to provide your protagonist with new clues about the nature of the battle she is waging. This pinch point usually comes at about the 37% mark of your story. For your wounded protagonist, this is where she is punished for using her lie. In her old life, using her lie helped her achieve what she wanted, but now this no longer works. She will try to use her old lie-based mindsets to reach her goals and will be punished by failures until she begins to learn how things really work. Example first pinch point from Thor. Thor's brother Loki learns he is in fact a frost giant adopted by Odin. Odin falls into the Odin sleep, from which his family fears he may never awaken and Loki must take the throne. The midpoint. This is your second obstacle and it represents the biggest conflict yet, the most dramatic turning point in your story. The protagonist will realize the antagonist's true dangers, and for the first time perhaps, your protagonist becomes more actionary instead of reactionary. The midpoint comes at about, you guessed it, the 50% mark in your story. It is also at this point that your protagonist starts to see the truth of her lie, but doesn't reject it yet. And in fact, she cannot recognize the truth and the lie as incompatible, as she might try to use both in Act 2. Example midpoint from Thor. After confidently battling his way through S.H.I.E.L.D.'s hastily erected compound, Thor is stunned to realize he cannot lift his hammer due to his father's proclamation that only someone worthy can lift it. In his immediate humility after realizing why he can't raise the hammer, we can see the glyph on the hammer's side indicating he is now worthy, although he doesn't get a chance to try again. Second pinch point. The second pinch point highlights the antagonist's capabilities and the possible defeat of the protagonist. This pinch point reminds the protagonist and readers of what's at stake. At the same time, new information to the plot begins setting up the major events of the third plot point and foreshadows the final showdown in the climax. The second pinch point comes at about the 62% mark of your story. During the second pinch point, for the first time, your protagonist is rewarded for using the truth by using truth-based actions to combat the antagonist and move nearer his ultimate plot goal. Example second pinch point from Thor. Loki returns to Jotunheim and strikes a deal with their king Laufey, who is his own father, although Laufey does not seem to know that. He promises to sneak Laufey into Asgard if Laufey will kill the sleeping Odin, thus making Loki king. Third plot point. This is the third obstacle. It is a key turning point your protagonist must overcome, where your character hits rock bottom. And it's a physical moment where the protagonist's goals are endangered. This point forces a crisis when the protagonist believes she has a winning chance against the antagonist, but there's an unexpected but foreshadowed reversal. The third plot point comes at about the 75% mark of your story. Example third plot point from Thor. Loki sends the golem to kill Thor and lay waste to Earth. Thor attempts to stop the golem. By the end of Act 2, your protagonist will have been forced to start reacting to her new world and will learn to be honest about herself and her situation. Before we continue on to Act 3, if you're finding this content valuable, please work out that like button. Act 3. Coming into Act 3, your protagonist has been kicked down by that third plot point, and now he must scramble to find his balance before facing the antagonist in the climax. Act 3 does not begin by tying up loose ends, rather it shakes things up by pushing your protagonist to his breaking point. Act 3 is all about intensity and resolution, and it has 4 important hallmarks: the dark night of the soul, break into 3, the climax, and the resolution. Act 3's length can be comparable to the beginning of your book, making up approximately 15 to 25%. Dark Night of the Soul. The term coined by Blake Snyder in his book Save the Cat is a vital point when your protagonist reaches deep inside himself to find the final best idea to save himself, but the idea is nowhere in sight. Many place the Dark Knight at the end of Act 3 with the third plot point. But I mark a difference here. The third plot point is the physical moment the protagonist is kicked down, which is called a scene. Scenes propel a story forward as the character attempts to achieve a goal. The start of Act 3 should start with a sequel. Sequels provide an opportunity for the character to react to the scene, analyze the new situation, and decide upon the next course of action. In this case, the protagonist will react to the third plot point, moving into the Dark Night of the Soul, where he reaches his breaking point and he loses hope. The Dark Night is where the protagonist is confronted by this low moment, brought about by his continued refusal to fully reject the lie. He must see the true stakes he'll lose by continuing to embrace his lie. It even threatens the protagonist's story goal more than any prior event in the story. And this is the moment when he feels defeated and he must accept the truth that undermines his false belief. For your outline, write a couple of sentences that reiterates the antagonist's threat and reinforces or raises the story's stakes. Example, Dark Night of the Soul from Thor. The golem knocks Thor down. He seems to turn away, pacified, false victory, only to turn back and strike Thor a mortal wound. Thor sacrifices himself to his brother's anger. Break into 3. Another term coined by Blake Snyder, this is the protagonist's answer so that he can move forward. It's often a eureka moment influenced by a prior event in your story that synthesizes all the protagonist's knowledge and experience to create a working solution. This can be written as a single sentence in your outline. Example, break into 3 from Thor. Thor seemingly dies and he fully realizes what makes him worthy. Mjolnir returns to him. This is all foreshadow from earlier when Thor was unable to completely lift up his hammer, and Mjolnir now raises him back up. Climax. The climax is the moment when the two speeding trains finally collide into a single unforgettable scene. The protagonist enters the final confrontation with the antagonistic force to decide whether or not he will gain the thing he wants. The protagonist wields the truth to gain what he needs, and he ends the conflict between himself and the antagonistic force. Climax example from Thor. Thor returns to Asgard to stop Loki, who has saved Odin from Laufey, killing both his own father and making himself out to be the hero of the day. Loki opens the Bifrost upon Jotunheim in order to tear it apart. He and Thor battle. Resolution. Bring in your one-sentence conclusion from part 1 and add a couple more sentences. This will complete your extended outline. At the end of writing my extended outline, I now have a basic roadmap of where I'm heading. I allow myself to take detours if I need to. Sometimes I add more to the points in the extended outline, and then one last thing I do before writing my novel is I grab all those scenes from that Word document that I had imagined before and I place them into my extended outline where I think they will happen. Then, like I did after completing part 1, I'll stew a bit on the extended outline and add other scene ideas as I think of them. After a couple of days, and as I get more excited about my story, I dive into writing my book. In most cases, the story just flows out, but sometimes the map is just not as good as it could be, and you may need to rework parts of it, and that's fine. Again, there is no right or wrong way to approach the writing process, just as long as you start writing. Don't forget about the Pit Stop worksheet in the description box below. It's filled with many of the details that I discussed today, along with blank spaces for you to fill in with your working outline. If you fill out the Pit Stop worksheet, I would love to hear about your successes. If you have any questions about anything I covered today or the Pit Stop worksheet, please leave those in the comments below. Thank you for hanging out with me through this final episode in my series, How to Write a Fiction Book, and happy writing!